Good morning. Today we will look at the detailed summary, line wise summary of the poem Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray. First, let us quickly recap a little about Thomas Gray himself. Thomas Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard, was first published in 1751. Gray may, however, have begun writing the poem in 1742, shortly after the death of his close friend Richard West. An elegy is a poem which laments the dead. Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard is noteworthy in that it mourns the death not of great or famous people but of common men. The speaker of this poem sees a country churchyard at sunset. A churchyard, by the way, is the place, the area. Another word for it is the graveyard, which is usually attached to a church. So he sees a country churchyard at sunset, which impels him to meditate on the nature of human mortality. The poem invokes the classical idea of memento mori, a Latin phrase which states plainly to all mankind. And I quote, "Remember that you must die." The speaker considers the fact that in death there is no difference between great and common people. He goes on to wonder if among the lowly people buried in the churchyard there had been any natural poets or politicians whose talent had simply never been discovered or nurtured. This thought leads him to praise the dead for the honest, simple lives that they lived. Gray did not produce a great deal of poetry. The Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, however, has earned him a respected and deserved place in literary history. The poem was written at the end of the Augustan age and at the beginning of the Romantic period, and the poem has characteristics associated with both literary periods. On the one hand, it has the ordered, balanced phrasing and rational sentiments of neoclassical poetry. On the other hand, it tends towards the emotionalism and individualism of the Romantic poets. Most importantly, it idealizes and elevates the common man. A quick recap about the author's biography. Born in the Cornhill district of London in 1716, Gray was the son of Dorothy Atrebus Gray, a milliner, and Philip Gray, a scrivener. A milliner is a maker of hats for women, and a scrivener is a person who acts as a clerk to a notary, that is a lawyer. A clerk to a lawyer is a scrivener. Gray's father was a mentally disturbed and violent man who at times abused his wife. Gray attended Eton School from 1725 until 1734, when he entered Cambridge University. He left Cambridge in 1738 without taking a degree, intending to study law in London. However, he and childhood friend Horace Walpole embarked on an extended tour of Europe. The two separated in Italy in 1741 after a quarrel, and Gray continued the journey on his own. He returned to London later in the year, shortly before his father died. Gray then moved with his mother to Stoke Poges, Buckinghamshire, and began his most productive period of poetic composition. In 1742, Gray wrote his first major poem, Ode on the Spring, which he sent to his close friend Richard West, unknowingly on the very day of West's death from tuberculosis. In the next 3 months, Gray wrote Ode on a Distant Prospect of Eton College, Hymn to Adversity, and Sonnet on the death of Mr. Richard West. It is believed that he also worked on Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard during this time, though this poem was not published until 1751. Gray returned to Cambridge at the end of 1742 and received a Bachelor of Civil Law degree the next year. Gray lived at the university for most of the rest of his life, but he never took part in tutoring, lecturing, or other academic duties. Instead, he pursued his studies and writing, taking advantage of the intellectual stimulation of the setting. In 1757, Gray was offered the position of Poet Laureate, but he declined it. He moved to London in 1759 to study at the British Museum and remained there for 2 years. He read widely and earned a reputation as one of the most learned men in Europe. Except for regular trips back to London and elsewhere in England, Gray stayed in Cambridge from 1761 until the end of his life. In 1768, Gray was named Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, an office he held until his death in 1771. Now let us look at the summary of the poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. Lines 1 to 4. We will now look at the summary of the poem, stanza by stanza. Lines 1 to 4. I will first quote from the text. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowering herd winds slowly over the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Unquote. In the first stanza, the speaker observes the signs of a parting day drawing to a close. A curfew bell ringing, a herd of cattle moving across the pasture, and a farm laborer returning home. The speaker is then left alone to contemplate the isolated rural scene. The first line of the poem sets a distinctly somber tone. The curfew bell does not simply ring, it knells, a term usually applied to bells that are rung at a death or a funeral. From the start, then, Gray reminds us of human mortality. Stanza 2, lines 5 to 8. Again, I read the text. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds, save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. Unquote. The second stanza sustains the somber tone of the first. The speaker is not mournful, but pensive, as he describes the peaceful landscape that surrounds him. Even the air is characterized as having a solemn stillness. Stanza 3, lines 9 to 12. To quote, "Save that from yonder ivy-mantled tower, the moping owl does to the moon complain, of such as wandering near the secret bar, molest her ancient solitary reign." Unquote. In lines 9 to 12, stanza 3, the sound of an owl hooting intrudes upon the evening quiet. We are told that the owl complains. In this context, the word does not mean to whine or to grumble, but to express sorrow. The owl's call, then, is suggestive of grief. Note that at no point in these three opening stanzas does Gray directly refer to death or a funeral. Rather, he indirectly creates a funeral atmosphere by describing just a few mournful sounds. Stanza 4, lines 13 to 16, and I quote, "Beneath those rugged elms that yew trees shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep." It is in the fourth stanza that the speaker directly draws our attention to the graves in the country churchyard. We are presented with two potentially conflicting images of death. Line 14 describes the heaps of earth surrounding the graves. In order to dig a grave, the earth must necessarily be disrupted. Note that the syntax of this line is slightly confusing. We would expect the sentence to read, "where the turf heaves," not "where heaves the turf." Gray has inverted the word order. Just as the earth has been disrupted, the syntax imitates the way in which the earth has been disrupted. But by the same token, the rude forefathers buried beneath the earth seem entirely at peace. We are told that they are laid in cells, a term which reminds us of the quiet of a monastery, and that they sleep. Lines 17 to 20. Stanza number 5. To quote the text, "The breezy call of incense-breathing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock's shrill clarion or the echoing horn, no more shall rouse them from their lowly bed." If the forefathers are sleeping, however, the speaker reminds us that they will never again rise from their beds to hear the pleasurable sounds of country life that the living do. The term lowly beds describes not only the unpretentious graves in which the forefathers are buried, but the humble conditions that they endured when they were alive. Lines 21 to 24. First, the text. "For them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees the envied kiss to share." Unquote. The speaker then moves on to consider some of the other pleasures the dead will no longer enjoy: the happiness of home, wife, and children. In the evening, the fireplace will no longer be lighted for their comforts, and the mistress of the house will no longer be busy with cooking the food for them when they return to their homes in the evening. Their children will no more run to them to welcome them in childish accents when they return home after their day's labor. None of them would any longer climb on their knees, that is, on the knees of their father, to get the kiss which each of them envies and wants for himself. Lines 25 to 28, stanza number 7. The text: Oft did the harvest to their sickle yield, their furrow oft the stubborn glebe has broke. How jocund did they drive their team afield, how bowed the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. Unquote. The dead will also no longer be able to enjoy the pleasures of work, of ploughing the fields each day. This stanza points to the way in which the elegy written in a country churchyard contains elements of both Augustan and Romantic poetry. Poetry that describes agriculture, as this one does, is called Georgic. Georgic verse was extremely popular in the 18th century. Note, however, that Gray closely identifies the farmers with the land that they work. This association of man and nature is suggestive of a romantic attitude. The Georgic elements of the stanza almost demand that we characterize it as typical of the 18th century, but its tone looks forward to the Romantic period. To paraphrase, these peasants were expert in their work. Their scythe is that instrument which is used to cut the crop, which is shaped like a question mark. In Hindi, it is known as hasya or hasli. Their scythes moved easily through the ripe corn in the fields, and they made furrows in the hard soil with their plough. How merrily did they drive their cattle into the field, and how easily they cut down the trees with the hard blows of their axes. We'll take a break now and continue tomorrow.